I'd like to kick off our conversation this evening with some words on the secret world of intelligence by another author with considerable personal experience and perspective.
The secret world, to people who are outside it, offers the promise of action. Others think and meet in committee and ponder, but the secret world, it seems, promises the chance of cutting right through the red tape, right through all the compromise, and doing what is actually necessary.
That was the late David Cornwell, better known to you as John le Carré, on the Newsweek radio show I ran, explaining the appeal to readers of what he called his stuff, including The Spy Who Came In from the Cold, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Smiley's People, and many more. I hope we can bring more of our conversations with Cornwell to the library later this year. But for this evening, suffice it to say, I think his analysis of the secret world's appeal goes far beyond readers to intelligence professionals, of course, but more dangerously also to many of the presidents whose policies they are bound to serve, for better and worse. Some intelligence veterans complain that the world rarely hears of their successes, only their failures. But too often, as SpyMasters documents, those secret successes can lead to terribly public disasters. So, Chris, let's start with the champagne party that then CIA boss William Webster threw in 1988. Remind us of his unique background, what he was celebrating, and what it led to.
Well, first, David, let me thank you for that introduction. And it's really kind of staggering to be interviewed by someone who also interviewed John le Carré. So I feel like I'm in great company. I should say it's a pleasure to be interviewed by David, because not only because he's such an outstanding journalist, but he's also quite a book reviewer and did what I thought were excellent and nuanced reviews of both of my books. I'm sure you can hear the siren going by. I apologize. I'm on the Upper West Side of New York. I wish I were in Southampton, and I think it's going by now. So anyway, Bill Webster, whom you mentioned, is an extraordinary character, now 97. And I have to say that when it comes to the SpyMasters, I was extraordinarily lucky, because the CIA directors that I cover, from Richard Helms all the way up to Gina Haspel and now Bill Burns, Joe Biden's director, are a rogues gallery of characters that you couldn't have dreamed up. Not even le Carré could have dreamed them up, I think. So I was lucky in that regard. Bill Webster was the right guy at the right time for the CIA, as some other directors, including George H.W. Bush, were. But he came in after a period of scandal, and he presided over the retreat of the Soviet Red Army from Afghanistan, which is what David's referring to here. The moment that happened, of course, you may all recall the story that George Cryle told in Charlie Wilson's War about the Mujahideen being armed with Stinger missiles by the CIA and driving the Soviet Red Army out of Afghanistan. This was at the time considered the most amazingly successful CIA covert operation of all time. And so Bill Webster immediately ordered up some champagne and invited everybody up to the 7th floor to his office, and they all began celebrating, little realizing that at that moment, the Mujahideen, who no longer had a Soviet army to oppose, were really beginning to form they were sowing the seeds of Al-Qaeda. So it's just one of those. I think what you were driving at, David, is that often CIA covert operations, even spectacularly successful ones, like the Mujahideen driving the Soviets out of Afghanistan, can have unintended consequences. So anyway, that's just part of Bill Webster's story. He was the only CIA director who also served as director of the FBI. When he came in, all the covert operatives were afraid that he was going to clip their wings and tell them to obey the law. And they called him the judge, which was not a compliment. But he succeeded. He was the right person at the right time. And let me just say before I go on too long here, let me just add that I love that comment by Le Carré about the secret world. And there's a real life version of that comment, a nonfiction version that was told to me by Bob Gates. And Bob Gates, of course, was CIA director as well as Secretary of Defense. Gates told me that, you know, Chris, we used to sit around in the Situation Room and the generals would all say, when we face some intractable problem, let the diplomats take care of this. And the diplomats would all say, let the generals take care of this. And when we all threw up our hands, that somebody would say, give it to the CIA. Well, that was the notion that, and has been the notion, of course, for years and years, that somehow the CIA could do the quick fix when all else failed. But as we all know, for every covert operation, there's often an unintended consequence.
Of course, the emergence of Al-Qaeda also presented you with examples of how presidents and their political concerns can override CIA analysis and advice. You write that warnings about the danger of Al-Qaeda were coming thick and fast by 1997, especially from then CIA Director George Tenet. Remind us of his background, the solution he proposed to Bill Clinton, and Clinton's reaction, even after Al-Qaeda bombed 2 U.S. embassies in Africa, with personal scandal a significant factor.
Yeah, you know, there's an age-old lament out at Langley CIA headquarters in Virginia, and it goes along the lines of, in this town, there are only policy successes and intelligence failures. The CIA is always blamed for everything that goes wrong. And 9/11, when you look back at it, of course, was famously called a failure of imagination by the 9/11 Commission. It was considered an intelligence failure by many. In my view, and I write about this in great detail in the SpyMasters, 9/11 was not an intelligence failure. It was fundamentally a policy failure. It was the result of a White House, an administration that didn't want to hear about Al-Qaeda and didn't want to prepare for the unthinkable. And so it's true that even under Bill Clinton, George Tenet, who was then the CIA director, had a hard time persuading Clinton and his experts that Al-Qaeda was a serious, significant threat to the U.S. He presented a plan called the Blue Sky Memo, which would have called for going into Afghanistan and pulling these guys out of their caves and arresting them and taking down the organization. Well, Bill Clinton and his gang didn't really want to hear about that either. But by the end of his term, the consensus is that Clinton understood, he got it. That after the bombing of the African embassies, after all of this had gone on, that he understood the threat. Then comes George W. Bush, and I tell the story again without rattling on here forever. The story of the July 10 meeting at the White House, July 10, 2001, when George Tenet and his two principal lieutenants picked up the phone, called the White House. Condi Rice was there, George W. Bush was traveling, but he said, we got to come over right now. And it was the only time this ever happened in Tenet's tenure as CIA director. They went over, they sat down with Condi Rice, and they laid out their evidence for an imminent attack by al-Qaeda. It was coming, it was going to cost thousands of lives, and Cofer Black, who was Tenet's lieutenant, pounded his fist on the table and said, we have to go on a war footing now. Well, what happened? Nothing happened, essentially. All that, in retrospect, if Condi Rice had simply called a so-called principals meeting which is, the top expert, the heads of all the departments, Homeland Security, National Security Council, and so forth, in all likelihood, this plot would have shaken out. And there's a very good chance that 9/11 could have been prevented. But as Cofer Black put it to me, he said, the mindset was these were a bunch of, terrorists were a bunch of Euro lefties, drink champagne at night, blow up buildings during the day. They just couldn't wrap their heads around the notion that a bunch of people in caves in Afghanistan posed that kind of threat, and essentially dismissed it. So anyway, it's one of the stories. It's one of the stories that I tell in great detail in the book.
You quote Tenet as saying after one of these meetings that the White House didn't want the clock to start ticking. In other words, they didn't want to have to acknowledge that they had an early warning. You discovered the need not to know.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
The political need not to know. Exactly. And so what Tenet took from that was we don't want to be saddled with the fact that we knew too early about this.
That's right.
We'd rather be surprised, and that's very sad.
Yeah.
The CIA took its share of heat later for supposedly misinforming the Bush White House that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, or soon would, and that unseating Saddam Hussein would be a cakewalk. But you report that at least some in the agency were well aware that the Bush administration had intent to intervene in that country from the start. They knew of the pressure from top Bush men applied to shaping the supporting intelligence. And most dramatically to me, the document that ultimately led the Secretary of State to mislead the United Nations and the American people, and its origin was not the CIA.
It was essentially a memo drafted by Scooter Libby. Some of you may remember Scooter Libby, who of course was Dick Cheney's right-hand person in the Bush White House. I think it's the notion that, first of all, there's no question about it that the Iraq War and the intelligence failure, the skewing of intelligence that paid the invasion of Iraq was just one of the darkest chapters in CIA history. There's no question about it. I mean, if you former CIA directors have told me that when they go out and visit college campuses or speak anywhere in this country, there's a fundamental change since 9/11. Up until that point, Mike Morrell told me the basic feeling was that America was a force for good in the world. And afterwards, after Iraq, that was no longer true. That was a level of cynicism, maybe even more profound than Watergate, which was my generation when I was in college. So there's no question about it, but I also don't believe that I also think it's a little bit too simple to say that Cheney and his minions went over to the CIA and pressured them to tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. There's real debate about whether George Tenet actually believed the assessment that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. There were, without a doubt, major mistakes and illusions about Saddam. Nobody could really wrap their head around the notion that Saddam wanted everyone to think that he had weapons of mass destruction for his own purposes in the Middle East, to stay in power and to be feared. So there were huge mistakes. The assessment that he had WMDs was a fiasco. And there's no doubt in my mind that the infamous meeting in which Bob Woodward first reported, in which George Tenet said it's a slam dunk. There's no question about the fact that if Tenet had been doing his job, if he'd been the honest broker of intelligence that his job requires him to be, he would have said to the president, "Mr. President, we don't know." That's the honest answer here. So it was a huge failure.
But I thought that it was quite telling that in the end, the remarks to the United Nations were not based on CIA material, but on something that went through the Cheney office processing. That they had to rely. They couldn't get what they wanted.
Well, this is true, but it's also true. But it's also true. And if you talk to Colin Powell, as I did at length about this, and again, this is something Colin Powell has never recovered from. It'll be the first paragraph of his obituary, that UN speech, and he knows it. Colin Powell made damn sure that George Tenet would be sitting right behind him as he made those remarks before the United Nations. In fact, George said, "I'll meet you there," and Colin Powell said, "No, I'll pick you up." I'm going to come and pick you up and drive you there.
But to go back a step, I seem to remember a Bob Woodward story in the moment of Cheney and the Secretary of Defense going to the newly elected President Bush and saying, "This country is looking weak. We have to hit somebody." And Saddam Hussein seemed like the easiest, likeliest target. And that, I think, is what the CIA had picked up from that's the initial intent. We gotta knock somebody down, and who better than a guy who thinks we're his friends, and it's a piece of cake. Is that did you ever come across that clip?
Certainly. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, a lot of people at the CIA knew that that Bush wanted to go to war with Iraq, and that this was going to happen one way or the other. But the debate sort of continues. I talked to the late Les Gelb, marvelous guy, brilliant guy, and he insisted to me that they couldn't have gone. They couldn't have gone to war without Tenet's slam dunk. So I don't know. You can.
An even earlier example of White House manipulation and need not to know began with the CIA-supported coup against Iran's democratically elected President Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 under Director Allen Dulles and President Dwight Eisenhower. It reinstalled the Shah of Iran temporarily, but also lit the fuse to the fundamentalist Shiite revolution in Iran that seemed to catch the CIA by surprise. I always wondered about that because the very newest reporter in the Newsweek Paris bureau in 1979, Elaine Sciolino, later of the Times, who spoke on a Rogers Library Zoom last summer, had heard enough, almost as soon as she got there, to warn top editors that a bearded cleric in a nearby town was the heart of a growing Shiite unrest. Then she interviewed the Ayatollah Khomeini and was invited to fly back to Tehran with him after the revolution he sparked. You explained it to me. Tell us why and how President Nixon and Henry Kissinger purposely blinded the CIA in Iran for years before and after Khomeini's takeover.
This was another great disaster in CIA history. One of maybe the greatest intelligence failure of all was the fact that excuse me, the CIA did not see the Iranian Revolution coming.
But why?
It was obvious to Elaine Sciolino. It was obvious to a lot of people who were paying attention. The CIA willfully blinded itself to the imminent revolution, and partly because, as Bob Gates explained to me, I went and spent a couple of hours with Gates in the cabin that he has on a lake in Washington State. And we talked about the history of CIA and about this episode in particular. And he said, you know, Henry Kissinger cut a deal with the Shah of Iran. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, the deal was that as long as the Shah provided us with listening posts along the border, Iran's border with the Soviet Union, as long as we had the access to his oil and we had those listening posts along the border with the Soviet Union, we would not speak to his enemies. We would not talk to the opposition. And the Shah was, of course, paranoid about that. And he was always afraid of being undermined. And so the CIA essentially simply took all of its information from his notorious Secret Service, the SAVAK, it was called. It was a ruthless, brutal Praetorian Guard for the Shah of Iran, but the U.S. really didn't really have eyes and ears on what was going on.
But of course, the CIA, certainly down at the grassroots level, knew that they weren't doing a job that they had done, that they do in other countries routinely and had done in Iran in a previous era. So they were aware that they were not aware, and that was the deal. Carter's CIA director, Stansfield Turner, who was his Naval Academy classmate, seemed to acknowledge this in your book, this longstanding avoidance, to quote him, spying on friends. So it was an agreement, almost a White House order, don't do it, or at least don't let on that, don't let the Shah find out that you're doing it. But ironically, Turner was initially kept in the dark by Carter's White House about plans for what turned out to be a disastrous hostage rescue attempt. How and why could the CIA director be left out of something like that?
Well, Stansfield Turner is again one of these remarkable characters that I was lucky enough to have as the main characters in the book. He was a brilliant guy, legendary admiral. Jimmy Carter was arguably the most intelligent president of the 20th century, trained as a nuclear physicist, but Turner was smarter. Turner was ahead of him in his class in Annapolis. He had a chest full of medals, and he was considered just the perfect choice as CIA director, but he was manhandled by Zbigniew Brzezinski and the rest, and some of Carter's other advisors who were much better bureaucratic infighters. Stan Turner was a Boy Scout, and he was a lovely guy, but he was out of his depth against the likes of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And one of my favorite stories was how very early on, Stan Turner discovered that there was an early morning meeting in the Oval Office called an intelligence briefing. And Turner picked up the phone and called Zbig Brzezinski and said, Zbig, how can this be? How can there? This is an intelligence briefing. Zbig said, you're absolutely right, Stan. And he hung up the phone. And the next morning, the title of the briefing was changed to National Security Briefing. Stan Turner was still not invited. And so to fast forward to your point, David, Turner, who for some reason just never really earned Carter's trust. And I'll come back to a larger point about how important that is with CIA directors and presidents. Turner never really earned that trust with Carter for whatever reason. And in the end, he wasn't even told about the ill-fated attempt to rescue the hostages in Tehran until the planning was well underway.
Also ignored, you note, was a former CIA director around Washington, still around Washington, who well might have had some valuable experience and insight.
Richard Helms, who at the time was ambassador to Tehran, but who previously had been CIA director under both LBJ and Richard Nixon. And Dick Helms may be my favorite character in the book. I spent a lot of time with his widow, Cynthia Helms. sadly, she died a couple of years ago, but I spent some time with her in writing the book, and she was full of marvelous untold stories about Dick Helms and the challenge of trying to tell hard truths to LBJ about Vietnam and Richard Nixon. And I like to think that, I hope the SpyMasters really humanizes these directors. And what I mean by that is my favorite stories are the ones like Cynthia Helms telling me that Richard Helms would come home after a day at the office and tell her he had lash marks on his back from Bobby Kennedy hectoring him to get rid of Fidel Castro by fair means or foul. And she was full of stories like this. Dick Helms was, without going on too long about him, Helms was a flawed human being. He was far from perfect. He, as Cynthia put it, Chris, they were all asked to do things they shouldn't have done. And Helms did his share of those things. Illegal domestic surveillance of opponents of the Vietnam War at LBJ's insistence, drug experiments on unwitting subjects, all of these things that you've heard about. And yet, at the end of the day, Richard Helms arguably stood up for the rule of law and saved the CIA when he faced down Richard Nixon, who tried to get him to cover up Watergate.
Yeah.
He's one of my favorite characters.
One small CIA-led rescue mission did succeed in Tehran and Hollywood. So remind us about Argo.
That's right. Argo was an extraordinary success. I refer to it briefly in the book, but of course, this was a case of many of the hostages in Tehran. I mean, we all knew about the Americans being held, but the Canadians who were being held, this was a secret that was really kept quiet. And so a CIA officer hatched the notion of flying into Tehran and pretending to be a Hollywood producer, and with a crew of CIA officers, and they went and they met secretly with the Canadians, and then they all impersonated members of the crew and escaped in a tale that was really amazing and a great success story at the time.
Became the movie Argo.
Became the movie Argo. Yeah.
Speaking of Helms, whose intelligence credentials date back to World War II missions for the Office of Strategic Services, you say he personified the CIA in the 60s and 70s and disliked the moral ambiguity of the secret world as novelized by Le Carré. A former head of Britain's MI6 similarly snarked at those fictions. Talk more about how other CIA veterans you spoke with felt about the moral contradictions of real-life covert operations.
Well, a number of the men who went on to become directors of the CIA came out of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, during World War II. And this was an amazing cast of characters. Dick Helms, William Colby, William Casey, who later became Reagan's CIA director. Bill Colby was an extraordinary guy. He would parachute behind enemy lines into Norway and kill Nazis and escape back out and come back out to London. These guys were pretty extraordinary paramilitary characters. And the guys who came out of the OSS had no use for the nuances, the gray areas, the moral compromises that Le Carré loved to write about. For them, it was very simple. You had Nazis and you had Americans. And in the aftermath, in the immediate aftermath of the war, the Soviets and the KGB in particular were, as far as they were concerned, they were the Nazis. And they didn't really have any patience for Le Carre and his nuances and corrupted agents. These guys were true believers.
But the younger guys were somewhat different. You mentioned Mike Morrell, who was a deputy director who looked like he might succeed to the top spot. I've read that one of the reasons he didn't get it was some things he said to you in your documentary version of the SpyMasters, and it had to do with the rightfulness, the righteousness of what we politely call enhanced interrogation, waterboarding, and other forms of torture. And his quote was, should a country, the United States of America, which stands for human rights in the world, which stands for human dignity, probably more than any other country, do those techniques to another human being? That's a really reasonable question.
Yeah.
So it seems like, in later generations, people did start to feel that the hot war anti-Nazi techniques were not exactly kosher anymore.
Well, Mike Morrell is a very smart guy and a very interesting guy, and I got to know him pretty well in the course of doing the documentary. You've got, David, I think it's the first time you've mentioned it, but the book was preceded by a documentary called The SpyMasters, CIA and the Crosshairs, which I did for Showtime with the great Susan Zirinsky of CBS News and Jules and Gideon Naudet, who did 9/11 before that. And Morrell was fascinating because he attempted to take a very nuanced view of the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques. He would say, for example, that if I were captured and waterboarded by an enemy, would I say I was tortured? Yes, I would. If and I'm paraphrasing him now, but in effect, he said, if I were sleep deprived or put in, difficult physical positions, would I say, if I were slapped around a little bit, would I say I was tortured? Well, maybe that's a little bit more complicated. And Morrell, I think, importantly, what got him into trouble, and I think our documentary probably did get him into trouble, probably prevented him from becoming CIA director under the current administration. What got him into trouble was when he said that there was absolutely no question in his mind that enhanced interrogation techniques did result in disrupting plots and saving lives. He gave an example of it to us in the documentary, and it's in the book as well. So that became untenable, I think, when he, among others, was a candidate to become Joe Biden's CIA director.
Well, but didn't the FBI weigh in at a point saying that they sort of broke off their participation in those interrogations because they didn't believe that that there was a good chance they would get bad information, that people would say anything to stop the pain? I mean, when I was in Army intelligence school, the guys back from Vietnam were terribly despondent over the way the Green Berets, that they'd worked so hard to train in interrogation, would take a dozen Viet Cong in a helicopter and start pushing them out one by one until somebody finally talked. And that's why we won that war. Oh, no, we didn't.
Well, it's complicated. The truth is that if you sit down with the so-called wartime CIA directors, and I'm talking about George Tenet, Porter Goss, and some of the others, who, by the way, were never interviewed for the Senate Majority Report that concluded that no actionable intelligence was acquired, they to a person will insist that whether you approve of it or not, actionable intelligence was produced by the techniques. So it's a debate that continues among people at the CIA.
You give high marks as CIA boss, maybe the highest, to a man who was neither an intelligence veteran, an experienced diplomat, or a top military commander, but rather a savvy, well-connected Washington political figure. What personal qualities made 8-term Democratic Congressman Leon Panetta so successful at Langley, and especially with another risky covert helicopter mission in Pakistan?
Well, you know, I'm a great Leon Panetta fan. I will confess it up front. I wrote a book, as you know, about the CIA, about the White House chiefs of staff, called The Gatekeepers, and of course now the SpyMasters, about the CIA directors. And I would say that the great ones in both positions share some of the same attributes, some of the same characteristics. And I think that if you look at the history of CIA directors, there have been insiders who succeeded, there have been outsiders who succeeded. In my mind, one of the really undervalued attributes for a great CIA director is temperament and integrity. And, you know, to be a great White House chief of staff or CIA director, you have got to be able, you've got to be grounded. You've got to be confident enough to walk into the Oval Office, close the door, and tell the president what he doesn't want to hear. That's something that CIA directors and White House chiefs have in common. And it's no coincidence that Leon Panetta was among the best at both positions. And part of that is because he'd been a congressman for decades. He'd been OMB director. He'd been around the block. He'd had nothing to prove. He was also politically savvy, and he knew how to walk the corridors of Capitol Hill, and so I think all of those things are sometimes more important than intelligence experience.
Well, and he knew enough to not be in the picture when the raid to kill Khomeini went off, even though he was the one who forcefully agreed that they should act on the intelligence they had and do it. But if you look at that picture, it's everybody else. He's back at Langley. He's not sharing in the glory. So he knew how to let other people bask in that. To the degree you still keep in touch with CIA sources under William Burns, a senior State Department official, former ambassador in Russia and Jordan, what more can you tell us about him and about efforts to rebuild morale within the agency and replace all those key staffers who left under Trump's endless derision?
Yeah, you know, CIA has really suffered over the last 4 years. You know, that they obviously had to answer to a report to try to persuade a president who had no regard for the truth. He politicized, I mean, only, you know, he did things to the CIA that Richard Nixon would have dreamt of doing if he could possibly have gotten away with it. Politicized the intelligence community by appointing people who had no regard for the truth. So Bill Burns has a big job ahead of him, and by all accounts, he's off to a very good start. You know, he's made it clear in no uncertain terms that that they should that the CIA should tell the truth and be honest brokers of intelligence, and I think he's been that way with the president from what I can gather. He's also one of the big priorities he's tackled is this very strange, mysterious outbreak of attacks on CIA personnel. It's known as it's been called the Havana syndrome, and because the first incident, I think, occurred in Havana, where CIA officers and some diplomats have been inexplicably stricken with bizarre symptoms of vertigo and migraines and imbalance. And the suspicion was that it might be some sort of a foreign intelligence weapon that was being aimed at CIA officers. That Burns has made this a priority, and he's gotten a lot of CIA officers into Walter Reed to be cared for, and they're still haven't gotten to the bottom of it. It's been one of his challenges.
I have a couple more questions that really are, past the deadline of your book. But what about the agency's role in or regarding Afghanistan after the preponderance or all U.S. forces are gone? Will it be able to step up operations for intelligence gathering and covert ops without undermining U.S. interests and what will be a most fragile peace at best?
I think it's going to be a huge problem and a real challenge for the CIA. I've asked Bill Burns about it. Burns told me that mysteriously, he said, we will retain a suite, S-U-I-T-E, of covert capabilities. I presume by that he means we will still have the ability to use lethal drones based in other parts of the world that will be able to get there. But I think there's no question about it. It's a huge challenge for the CIA. It's a long way to go if Al-Qaeda or other terrorists try to regroup and pose a threat to the U.S. I'll remind people, one of the ironies is that Barack Obama, the constitutional law professor and recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, presided over the biggest increase in lethal drone strikes in history in Afghanistan. One of the great ethical dilemmas that Leon Panetta faced as director was having to authorize lethal drone strikes. And I describe one of them in the book, in which Panetta, who is a devout Catholic, would finger his rosary beads and have to make a decision about whether to pull the trigger on a drone strike when he knew civilians were in the shot to take a terrorist off the battlefield. I digress a little bit, but I think that it's going to be very difficult for the U.S. and for the CIA to keep eyes on Afghanistan.
Do you fear any kind of need not to know in connection with President Biden's order for all U.S. intelligence services to determine definitively the origins of COVID, especially if it came by accident or design from the Chinese biolab in Wuhan? The answer could spark a lot more public anger and pressure for new penalties and could be a significant factor in Washington-Beijing relations.
It could. It's sensitive. There's no doubt about it. And but my sense is that Biden would not have ordered the intelligence community to go back and look at this issue if he didn't want to know the answer. He didn't have to do it. If he didn't want to know the answer, he didn't have to instruct them to go back and take another look. I think the evidence is still out. I don't think that there's any smoking gun, so far as we know, that it was a leak from the Wuhan lab. I think it's genuinely unknown at this point.
Another current question: what's your sense of CIA effectiveness regarding today's Russia? Resources on the ground there, or online capabilities to provide the kind of disruptive counter-hacking that Biden suggested might follow more Russian cyber attacks on U.S. systems? Is there there?
Well, there is there to this extent, and I wrote about this. In fact, it's the opening scene in my book, in the SpyMasters, is when John Brennan is in his office well past midnight in the summer of 2016, when he suddenly realizes all the threads have come together, and he's starting to figure out that the Russians are coming. The Russians are poised to disrupt the 2016 election, and what should he do about it? And the problem was that he then, of course, went to the White House and briefed Obama. And Obama was paralyzed by this, and partly because, and this goes to your question, it was true then, and it is still true today, that the U.S. has extraordinary offensive cyber capability, and this was discussed. Should the U.S. in effect take down the Russian economy? should the U.S. Really mount a serious cyber offensive against Russia in retaliation? And the trouble is that we live in a glass house, and our offense is so much better than our defense that this could have resulted in an escalation that would have been just out of control. So, and that remains the case, that we still are almost defenseless against cyber attacks, and it's a real problem.
But could we turn the lights out in the Kremlin at least?
Well, maybe we could. I'm quite sure we could, but I think that there's a real hesitance to start something which we don't know how it will end.
Except that we're experiencing it episode by episode, election by election, and in between elections. Yeah. I know others want to have some questions. I'd just like to ask you what else you'd like our audience to know about your book, about the CIA and its leaders.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of territory, and I really enjoyed it, David. I think that I guess I'd like to just reemphasize the fact that I really see this as a story. If nothing else, I hope I succeed in humanizing this extraordinary cast of characters, from Dick Helms, who was the quintessential CIA director back in the 60s, Martini in one hand, Chesterfield in the other, who could hold his own on a dance floor with Fred Astaire, which he did, by the way, at a 1975 state dinner for the Shah of Iran. And Bill Colby, who revealed the so-called family secrets and sparked a real civil war within the CIA. George H.W. Bush, William Casey, Bob Gates, David Petraeus, Leon Panetta. I was lucky that I had such an extraordinary cast of characters to write about.
All right, I think I'll turn it over to Penny and take some questions from our audience.
I see that someone actually something in the chat a while ago, so we could start with that maybe. It was Tim asked, does the CIA remain deeply involved in measures to counter the mullahs and revolutionary guards in Iran?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. One of the stories that I tell in the SpyMasters, which has never been reported before, was this extraordinary decades-long manhunt by the CIA and by Mossad for the world's most wanted terrorist, not Osama bin Laden, but a man named Imad Magnia, who was the operational mastermind of Hezbollah. And he reported to Iran and to General Soleimani, whose name you may recognize. He was the general that Trump ordered killed in a lethal drone strike in January 2020. It's an incredible story. It was, this finally ended in 2008 when, in a joint operation between the CIA and Mossad, they tracked Mr. Magnia down in Damascus, and the CIA went and swapped the back of his SUV in with another, which had a bomb that they had built in North Carolina, which was remotely triggered by Mossad and blew him to smithereens. This was in 2008. So there's no question about the fact that the U.S. and the CIA have gone to extraordinary lengths to keep the Iranians in check. Magnia is an amazing story, but and clearly Mossad continues to watch the Iranian nuclear program very closely. They've assassinated many of the nuclear scientists. They've disrupted it with cyber attacks. Beyond that, who knows?
I don't see any hands right now.
Well, I have one more question about Afghanistan. The notion that the CIA is going to sort of keep them in check, is that not sort of watching the wrong barn? I mean, didn't we learn from the truth of Afghanistan that, you know, whatever was going on in the caves, the guys came mostly from Saudi Arabia, and in today's even more interconnected, computer-connected world, they don't have to be in the caves in Afghanistan. I mean, ideas spread around, people can communicate. Wasn't 9/11 in fact proof that wiping out a band of people in Afghanistan was not really going to deal with the issue, and that the spread of activist Shiism and all of the rifts and the passions there, I mean, focusing solely on Afghanistan because the Taliban is going to come back, it just seems to me out of scale with where threats are really likely to come from.
Yeah. Well, and of course, the threats are coming from everywhere. And we haven't talked about China. We haven't talked about North Korea. But I know that that Bill Burns, the new CIA director, is devoting much of his time to China, because China is, of course, a tremendous threat economically, and with the stealing of our secrets and technology and all the rest. So we're entering. I think it's fair to say that we're in a very different era. We're not so much worried about guys with beards and caves in Afghanistan so much as we are about cyber and many other threats that, as you say, come from all over the world.
I think Penny had a question. I think you just have to unmute, Penny.
Penny, unmute.
I think she's trying to. It's been a long time.
Well,
I
have to go ahead.
Can you get it, Penny?
I'm sorry. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you're
Yes.
good.
I'm blinded by the light, as they say, because there's a lot of light coming in here. I couldn't see the button. Anyway, I'm just curious to ask about future plans, or has writing this book sparked other areas that you'd like to explore for a possible next book?
Well, funny you should ask, because I have embarked on another book, and it's been challenging and exciting at the same time. So I just started work on a book on the Biden White House year one, which I hope will be the inside account of Joe Biden's first year and how his White House operates. It's obviously exciting because it's we're at a moment in history which I think is extraordinary and important, and it's also challenging because this is unlike Biden's predecessor, who set his hair on fire on a daily basis and whose White House leaked constantly, full of drama. This White House is extremely disciplined and buttoned down, and not easy to penetrate. So that's what I'm up to.
Maybe Biden is the most open person in his administration.
Sorry?
I said Biden could be the most open person in his own administration.
Yeah, and yet one of the fascinating things I think about Biden is that this is somebody who was famously undisciplined and unscripted. I know a senator who told me that he once left a 35-minute voicemail on his phone. This is somebody that we never really thought about as being terribly disciplined, and yet he is. I think he's really been hitting his marks with a, and of course, it's funny because David and I have argued about the subhead of my previous book, which argued that the chiefs of staff define every presidency. Ron Klain is one of the very best, and I think you can see that Biden is hitting his marks with a first-rate chief of staff.
Well, let me say that one could argue that the subtitle is right in that the parade of chiefs of staff sort of defined the Trump presidency, not any one of them individually, but the way he dealt with that office was clearly one of the definitions. Will your book on Biden, to some degree, because you'll deal with the new CIA director, provide a bit of an update on the SpyMasters?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. It's early days yet, but I've already talked to Bill Burns at some length, and it's been fascinating. I think that we may all forget now. This was a couple of months ago, but there was almost a coup d'état in Jordan. Speaking of the Shah of Iran, King Abdullah had to round up members of his family and others who almost tried to depose him. Well, I think that Burns, who knows that area of the world very, very well, he was ambassador to Jordan and he worked with that CIA station and he knows them all very well. Burns was a good guy to have around at the time. He went straight to the White House and persuaded Biden to pick up the phone and call Abdullah. And anyway, he appears to have weathered that storm.
I think I saw that Tom had a question. I don't know if it's been answered or if you still.
Nope.
Oh,
It hasn't been
okay.
answered.
Go ahead.
Thank you for your talk.
My pleasure.
I'm looking forward to reading the book. As a historian, I've long lamented the fact that we write histories of the foreign policies of various countries, and there's a huge piece missing, which is the intelligence piece. And that's largely because all these documents are classified. I'm still trying to get CIA documents from the early 50s, which I can't get out of them. So there are these gaps in our historical knowledge. A number of years ago, I wrote a long review of 5 books on CIA operations in China and Tibet. And one of the things that came out of that was that they were all failures. And that we don't really understand how intelligence works in the foreign policy picture and how many failures, and you mentioned several failures yourself, of course, in this talk, how many times the CIA fails. And it's really incumbent on us as citizens to know more about how these things go on. They're done in our name, after all, using our money. And so we need far more information. I'm not talking about details or names of agents or anything like that. That, of course, should stay classified. But in general, we need to know much more about what these intelligence agencies do in our name.
Well, you sort of brought us back full circle to that Le Carré comment at the very beginning about the secret world. You know, I mean, it's way too easy to just assume that we can solve these things with a covert operation when we can't solve them diplomatically or militarily. And so I think one of the good things that has came out of the scandals of the 1970s, I mentioned the so-called family jewels that were revealed back then, and all the stories about plots to kill Castro and others, and some of the horror stories. There was a sea change as a result, and congressional oversight really began. So one of the at least advantages of the modern era is that covert operations really have to be approved by Congress, by the Gang of Eight, so I think that's reduced the number of cockamamie, ill-fated operations that go on. but it hasn't eliminated them.
Would you say, in your judgment, that the United States gets more benefit out of the intelligence gathering and analysis of the CIA than it does in attempts to solving complex problems through covert operations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's to use that awful cliche that that Biden uses all the time, that, there's a battle for the soul of the CIA that's been going on for decades. And it's between those who think that the CIA should abide by its original charter, which was to gather intelligence. It's an intelligence gathering organization. And to some extent, since 9/11, it's also become a lethal killing machine. And there's a real tug of war of tension between those two camps. There's no question about it. And George Tenet, I remember George Tenet saying to me, and of course, he's one of the great characters in the book. I mean, Shakespearean. Imagine having on your watch the walk up to 9/11, 9/11, invasion of Afghanistan, enhanced interrogation techniques, and then weapons of mass destruction. Tenet, it took us a year to get Tenet into the chair to do an interview, and when he did, he stayed for 5 hours. And he, when I asked him, said, "So you didn't cook the books on Iraq?" He said he practically jumped out of his chair, and he said, "Listen, if we wanted to cook the books, all we had to do was say that Al Qaeda was in bed with Iraq and with Saddam. That's game, set, match, over. That's all we had to do. We never did that. We never did that. We never said that," which was true. I mean, others were, Cheney and others were saying it, but the CIA was not.
Right.
So I'm long digression here, but the comment from Tenet I was about to mention is that he said, right after 9/11, when the first lethal drones were launched, he said, do we really want the head of a civilian agency, not in the chain of military command, to be pulling the trigger on lethal attacks on, foreign combatants? He said, "I never got the answer to that question." So there's a real war, battle going on within the CIA between those who think it should be intelligence gathering alone and those who think it has a paramilitary function.
Well, if it's all right with Yvette, if there are no other questions, I'd like to say a few final words of conclusion, but I don't want to cut anybody off who's got a question or a comment.
I don't see anything. I'm scanning. I think we're
Take
good.
it away, David.
Well, then I guess I have to say I'm afraid our time is just about up. I'd like to say thanks to Chris Whipple, whose book is The SpyMasters: How the CIA Directors Shape History and the Future, from Scribner, and to all of you in the audience, and also to Yvette Postel and the Rogers Memorial Library for making this presentation possible. Have a good evening, all of you.
Thank you all so much. Thanks
Thank
for having me.
Thank you both so much. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Take care.
All right, Chris, we'll talk.
How do I stop?
Thank you, David.
A pleasure.
Okay.
Bye, everyone. Have a nice night.
Bye.
Bye, Penny.
Bye. Bye, David.
Bye-bye. Nice to see you.